Thank you, gentlemen. That sounded good. My only response is, okay, women. You're next. Thank you, TJ, for that children's story. Appreciated it very much. If you want to look at that hymn we sang for opening song 438, and the reason I picked that hymn, this is one of the songs that James White used to sing, one of the founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. He used to sing it before October 22nd, 1844, and I'll explain that in a little bit, that date. But for us as Adventists, we know that's a very historic date. But he would sing that song, and as he came down the aisle, he'd be thumping his Bible. I've always wanted to do that, so this gave me a chance to do that. And I had to have the ladies with me because I can't keep rhythm to save my soul. So I needed them with me. So thank you, ladies. And so we've picked a lot of old hymns today because it is Adventist Heritage Month, and today is certainly October 22nd, 1844, a very significant date in Adventist history. I want to give credit to Robert Falkenberg, our former General Conference president who passed away about a year ago, and to the Ellen G. White Estates for much of what I will share with you today in terms of our church history and some of the things that are going on. And I think that every Adventist needs to review this from time to time so that we remember where we come from. Now, and to clarify, we're talking about Adventists. We're not talking about Seventh-day Adventists at this point, because on October 22nd, 1844, there were no Seventh-day Adventists. And the Millerite movement was called the Great Advent Movement. And so it was called Adventists, but there were no Seventh-day Adventists. We didn't organize it as a church until 1863. So it does tell, though, that it was a group of people that were looking for the second coming of Jesus. And to start with, I've asked Jason if he would play a YouTube for us, a reenactment of what October 22nd, 1844 must have been like and leading up to it.
And Daniel had a vision from God, and he said, I was frightened and fell upon my face. But he said unto me, understand, O Son of Man, your wisdom belongs to the end of time.
In the mid-19th century, a Baptist preacher, William Miller, traveled the country preaching that the second coming of Christ was close at hand. Tens of thousands believed he was right.
The pivotal text that William Miller centered his apocalyptic lectures on was Daniel 8:14. Unto 2,300 days, and then shall the sanctuary be cleansed.
Cleansed!
And he thought the sanctuary was the earth, and it would be cleansed by the fires of the second coming.
Miller's followers determined the cleansing would come on a single date, October 22nd, 1844. One of those who came to hear Miller speak was a young woman, Ellen White.
And at that time, Ellen White, my great-grandmother, and the whole family went to hear him. They were all impressed. They were impressed by his sincerity, his knowledge of the Bible, his understanding of prophecy, and his ability to explain things clearly and succinctly.
Described by the Holy Scriptures. Cleansing by fire.
As October 22nd approached, true believers prepared to meet their God. Farmers abandoned their crops and livestock. Shop owners closed their businesses. Others simply threw away their money.
Rock of ages, cleft for me. Let me hide myself in thee. Let the war
And that night people gathered and waited to be united with their God.
from thy wounded side which flowed.
But the next morning, Ellen White and the others awoke to a world unchanged.
She believed with her whole heart that Jesus was coming. She writes in her own writings, I went home and I cried all night.
Can you picture the disappointment and what it must have been like? As we think about the 172nd anniversary of October 22nd, 1844, this date stands above all others in Adventist history. More people remember this date than anything else, than even 1863 when we organized as a church. And it should be remembered because it is the day that marked the end of the 2300-day prophecy in Daniel 8:14. And it tells us there that at the end of the 2300 days, judgment would come. The judgment seen in heaven would begin. Daniel chapter 7, verses 9 and 10 tell us, I beheld till the thrones were cast down, and the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like the pure wool. His throne was like the fiery flame, and his wheels as burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. Thousands ministered unto him, and thousands times 10,000 stood before him. His judgment was set, and the books were opened. And what happened in 1844, as you look at this scene, is the early Adventists thought that Jesus was coming back on October 22nd. And what they didn't realize as they looked at the heavenly sanctuary and the services in the heavenly sanctuary, what they didn't realize, instead of Jesus coming out of the most holy place and coming back to this earth for the second coming, he was going into the most holy place, and he was beginning the work of the judgment and deciding who would be saved and who would be lost. And so as we look back today, rather than becoming a day of disappointment, it really marks for us a very significant and historic time in world history. Because this was an event that was happening all over the world. It wasn't just happening in New England where hundreds and thousands of people left their churches to prepare for the second advent of Jesus. It was happening in Europe. And many of the early reformers believed this also. We think about the Reformation times. But we're ahead of our story. I want to go back. As we know, 172 years ago, our Adventist forebears really looked forward to the time when Jesus would come again. I want you to come with me in your thinking to 1844. And I want you to go to a small house on 44 Clark Street in Portland, Maine. This is where the Harmon family lived. Ellen White's maiden name was Harmon. The father, Robert, is a hat maker. Mother, Eunice, is a homemaker. And both parents, as well as their children who were still living at home, had accepted Adventism under the preaching of William Miller. And so they were following all of Miller's preachings. And twice Miller had come to Portland, Maine, in March of 1840 and again in June of 1842. And both times this Harmon family went to hear him. And in September of 1843, because of their beliefs in the second coming of Jesus and the soon return, the Harmon family was disfellowshipped from the Methodist Church. And they'd been members there all of their life. Even though they were no longer Methodists, they still worshiped with Millerite Adventists and they continued to share their faith to everyone who would listen about the second coming of Jesus. And Ellen White recalls this time just before October 22nd, 1844. Ellen Harmon. She tells us what it was like. With diligent searching of heart and humble confessions, we came prayerfully up to the time of expectation. Every morning we felt that it was our first work to secure the evidence that our lives were right before God. We realized that if we were not advancing in holiness, we were sure to retrograde. Our interest for one another increased. We prayed much with and for one another. We assembled in the orchards and groves to commune with God and to offer up our petitions to Him, feeling more fully in His presence and surrounded by His natural works. The joys of salvation were more necessary to us than our food and drink. If clouds obscured our minds, we dare not rest or sleep till they were swept away by the consciousness of our acceptance with the Lord. Ellen White, as she talks about this experience just before Jesus would come back again, and for those of you who may not be familiar with our faith, James and Ellen White and Joseph Bates are considered the founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They came out of this Millerite movement as they began to study their Bibles and look further into what was going on. But as Ellen White was writing about that time, just before Jesus would come back on October 22nd, 1844, here's what she said. This was the happiest year of my life. I mean, why shouldn't it have been? After all, Jesus was coming back again. If we really believed that Jesus was coming back again, wouldn't it be a happy time for us also? You know, I think it's, for us 172 years later, it's really hard for us to understand the feelings those pioneers must have had. And that kind of experience. Just think about it. Just weeks, then days, and finally only hours until Jesus would return again. If I really believed that Jesus were coming back next Tuesday, how would I act? What would I do? Would I really search my soul if I really knew Jesus was coming back next Tuesday? He was returning to them in 3 more days, the way they saw it. That would really give us pause to think, wouldn't it? What if we really knew that? We don't know the day or the hour. We don't know when it'll be. But we all must prepare like it is today. Christ didn't return. And again, there's no way that we can understand that terrible agony and heartache and sorrow that must have been happening when Jesus didn't come back. Remember, farmers left their farms. People sold everything. They threw their money in the streets. They locked up their shops. There was nothing for them. They had given it all for the sake of the gospel and to let people be ready for Jesus when he came again. Recalling that awful time, Hiram Edson, one of those early pioneers who lived in western New York State, wrote this. Our fondest hopes and expectations were blasted, and such a spirit of weeping came over us as I have never experienced before. It seemed that the loss of our earthly friends could have been no comparison. We wept and wept till the day dawned. If you go to the William Miller farm today, and Roberta and I have been there's what they call the Ascension Rocks, because several of the Millerites gathered there at William's farm, and they all sat out on this Ascension Rock. It overlooks the valley, and if you've ever been in New England in the fall, you know how beautiful it is. And here were this bare, open rocks, and they all camped right there, and they all sat on those rocks waiting for Jesus to come again. I can't imagine what it must have been like. And I'll admit, when I sat there, I wept too. And I also thought about, would I be ready? Would have I been ready if I would have been one of that group? The Harmon family, Ellen and the others, they endured the anguish of that day, which dawned with such bright hope and closed with such bitter disappointment. And that's why it's called the Great Disappointment. You can look it up in newspapers. You can look it up in old newspapers from New England and read about it. What had gone wrong? Why hadn't Jesus come as expected? Well, Hiram Edson gives us an insight into what was going through the minds of those disappointed believers. He recalls, I mused in my own heart saying, my Advent experience has been the richest and brightest of all my Christian experience. If this had proved a failure, what was the rest of my Christian experience worth? Has the Bible proved a failure? Is there no God, no heaven, no golden home city, no paradise? Is this all but a cunningly devised fable? Is there no reality to our fondest hope and expectation of these things? And we know that Hiram Edson, after that experience, the next day he was walking across the field with another Millerite Adventist believer, and he stops and he has this vision where a bright light comes down, and he sees what's going on in the sanctuary, and that partially explains what happened. And it gave him some hope. And out of that experience, several of these Adventists began to gather together, and they got out their Bibles, and they began to look and to search and to study and try and figure out what happened. Where did we go wrong? And out of that comes the great Advent movement, the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But now during this days and weeks of disappointment and afterwards, many people scattered. Many people left their faith. Many people didn't have anything to do with God. Many people gave up Adventism and went back to their old churches. And yet for a short time after, there were some of those Adventists that continued to believe that maybe Jesus was coming again. Maybe they just miscalculated some things just a little bit. And so that maybe he would come. But as the days turned into weeks, they had to force themselves to believe that he wasn't coming back again. And that October 22nd maybe really didn't mean anything. Or if it did, they had no idea what it was. It was also during this time that young Ellen Harmon took a turn for the worse. She had nearly fully recovered from an accident that she had when she was 9 years old. Somebody had thrown a stone, a schoolmate of hers, and hit her in the face. And because of this great disappointment, it caused her health to deteriorate. She said, "I could only speak in a whisper or broken tone of voice. One physician stated that my disease was dropsical consumption. He pronounced my right lung decayed and the left one considerably diseased, while the heart was seriously affected. He thought that I could live but a short time and might die suddenly at any time. It was very difficult for me to breathe when lying down. And at night I bolstered in almost a sitting position and was frequently awakened by coughing and bleeding at the lungs." And yet, when you think about it, here was this young lady who had her 17th birthday on November 26, 1844. She must have wondered about her future and about her relationship with God and what would happen. And like Hiram Edson, she couldn't deny the power of her Christian experience. She knew that God was real. She knew that Christ was very much a part of her life. Was God in the Advent movement or wasn't he? And she was questioning and wondering what was going on. And apparently her illness caused so much work for her mother that from time to time ladies in the community would take Ellen home with them, and they would watch over her and take care of her so Mom could get some rest. We would do that today for each other, wouldn't we? Helping each other out that way. And so this is how she happened to be at Elizabeth Haynes' home. This was one of the neighbor ladies that was also an Advent believer. And we don't know what exact date was. We know it was in December of 1844. And Ellen describes what happened to her next as she was staying at Elizabeth Haynes' home. She said, "In the morning, we bowed at the family altar. It was not an exciting occasion. There were but 5 of us present, all females. While praying, the power of God came upon me as I have never felt it before. I was surrounded with light and was rising higher and higher from the earth." Now picture these 5 women all gathered around in a circle, and one of them so ill she wasn't even expected to live. And uppermost in their thinking was the question, has God been leading our Adventist movement, or have we been deluded all of this time? Was prophecy fulfilled on October 22nd, or wasn't it fulfilled? In their hearts they would cry out, "Why, oh why are we so disappointed?" Today I want to look at Ellen White's first vision that came upon her with those 5 ladies, because it brings back assurance and encouragement as much to those back then as it does to us today. Here's her account, found in Spiritual Gifts. I turned to look for the Advent people in the world, but I couldn't find them. When a voice said to me, look again and look a little higher. At this I raised my eyes and saw a straight and narrow path cast high above the earth. On this path, the Advent people were traveling to the city, which was at the farther end of this path. And in her vision, Ellen seemed to be lifted up above the earth, like she was looking down on the earth. And so, disappointed that Christ had not returned, it was only natural for her to look down on the earth and wonder where God's people were at. After all, she knew good and well that they were still there, because she was still there. So she must have been surprised when the vision told her, look a little higher. But when she did, there she saw the people of God traveling to the holy city, the New Jerusalem. And in Matthew 7, verses 13 and 14, if you want to take your Bibles, Matthew 7, verses 13 and 14, we have a description of what she was looking at. Matthew 7, 13 and 14. Enter ye in at the straight gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction. And many there be which go in thereat, because strait is the gate, and narrow is the way which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it. She saw in her vision that God was warning her about that wide way and telling her to stay on the straight and narrow. And it was very assuring to her that she could see these Advent people on the straight and narrow path. It was a vision of encouragement and hope for all those who had been waiting for Jesus to come again. She also knew that there were others who had rejected the message of Christ's soon appearing. But even more serious were those who openly ridiculed the Adventists for believing in this time. How did she recognize those on the narrow path as being Adventists? And again, remember, we're not talking about Seventh-day Adventists. We're talking about this early Millerite movement. How did she recognize them as Adventists? We don't know, except that maybe she recognized some of the faces that were walking along that path on the way to the kingdom of heaven. And it took her over 2 hours to tell this story when she was in Portland, Maine in 1845. So I'm just taking a few moments to tell that experience that she had that took her 2 hours to tell. It must have been a real comfort, though, to her and those band of ladies as they shared it with others to see their people that had waited for Jesus to come walking on that narrow trail to the kingdom of heaven to meet Jesus. While on earth, Christ gave a warning to his followers. And you can find that warning in John chapter 15. John chapter 15 and verses 18 and 19. John 15, 18 and 19. This was a solemn warning that Jesus gave his followers. John 15, 18 and 19. If the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If ye were of the world would love his own. But because you're not of the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hateth you. And the people back then realized that. Those great Advent believers realized that they had to live in the world, but they didn't have to be of the world. And this is what God was trying to tell her, that as they traveled to the holy city, he was trying to tell them, don't be a part of the world. You have to live in it, but don't be a part of the world. If they were on this narrow path, then spiritually they had to be separated from the world. And it was warning them, don't get swallowed up. Don't get distracted by the world. Don't get pulled away by the world and all the things that the world has to offer. Back then it brought real hope and encouragement to those believers on the path, on the road to the kingdom of heaven. And it also should bring the same assurance and hope for us today, to realize there is that straight and narrow way, but in that straight and narrow way is the way to the kingdom of heaven. And we need to stay on that. We need to be away from the world, and yet we need to live in the world. Continuing the description of the people on the narrow path, Ellen White says, they had a bright light set up behind them at the first end of the path, which an angel told me was the midnight cry. This shone all along the path and gave light for their feet, that they may not stumble. And she sees this bright light, and the bright light is shown to her as the midnight cry, as this time in Earth's history when it was bringing people back to Christ and bringing people back to the realization that Jesus was coming back again and that they needed to be ready for him. It was this midnight cry. Matthew 25, as we read in our scripture reading, it reminds us, and at midnight there was a cry made, behold, the bridegroom cometh, go ye out to meet him. And the 5 wise virgins had their oil ready and their lamps trimmed. They were ready for the bridegroom to come. But the foolish virgins had run out of oil and didn't have enough oil to light their lamps, and they weren't ready for the bridegroom to come. And so the midnight cry of October 22nd, 1844 became known as just that, the midnight cry. But how could it be light? How could it help? It didn't seem to clarify what was going on or why Jesus hadn't come back. And yet this was the first clue to the cause of their disappointment, that they were waiting for Christ to return, but not necessarily at that time, that they still had a path to travel on. They still had a ways to go. And the warning was to keep their eyes fixed on Jesus. And somehow through the ages, the church, the Adventist church, and later the Seventh-day Adventist church, has lost sight of that from time to time. And so in 1888, they had to have a general conference session. At this general conference session, they had to be reminded again, get back to faith in Jesus. And down through the ages, we've had to be reminded again. In the 80s, 1980s, we were reminded again, righteousness by faith. Faith in Jesus. Don't become so hooked and so fixated on the commandments that you forget about Jesus, because everything we do and say is wrapped up in our love for Jesus and our relationship with him. And from time to time, we all have to be reminded of that. We need to remember that it was Jesus that raised the son of the widow of Nain, put the mud on the eyes of the blind man so he could see, drove the money changers from the temple, broke loaves and fishes to feed the 5,000. It was also he who raised up over the troubled waters of the Sea of Galilee to calm the storm. He patted the heads of the children who came to be blessed by him. His arms outstretched on a cross to guarantee our salvation. The same mighty arm, we're assured, will comfort and sustain us and lead us and guide us no matter how long the journey until we reach the city, until Jesus comes again. But Ellen Harmon continues. Others rashly denied the light behind them and said it was not God that had led them out so far. The light behind them went out, leaving their feet in perfect darkness. And they stumbled and got their eyes off the mark and lost sight of Jesus and fell off the path down into the wicked world below. To me, this is one of the most incredible statements in this whole vision, because it reminds us that we can lose our way, that we can look on the world and get so caught up with the world that we can stumble and fall off of the path of righteousness on the way to the kingdom of heaven. Again, we need to remember her mindset at the time. They were discouraged. They were down. They were trying to figure out what's going on. And God is giving them hope in this vision. And as it goes on, we have to ask ourselves, how could a girl merely 17 years old foresee this truth about October 22nd? a truth in which she didn't fully understand herself or comprehend herself. And yet, throughout the history of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, there have been some who have denied this great movement, the Advent movement of the 1830s and 40s. One of the greatest religious movements of history, of religious history. And many people have separated and walked away because they wouldn't accept what God has done for His people and how God has been with His people. And in this vision, she continues on. And she begins to share several things about the time when Christ would come back again, offering more hope and encouragement. She saw the 144,000 were all sealed and perfectly united. And for the first time, she was shown the second coming of Christ. Consider that. Think about it a moment. If you went to sleep tonight and you dreamed in 3D of the second coming of Jesus Christ, and it was so real to you that you felt like you were there with it. Think how exciting that would be. Think of how joyful that would be. And listen to a portion of this excited teenager's graphic description of the Christian experience of Christ's return. Soon our eyes were drawn to the east, for a small black cloud had appeared about half as large as a man's hand, which we all knew was the sign of the Son of Man. We all in solemn silence gazed on the cloud as it drew nearer and became lighter, glorious, and still more glorious, till it was a great white cloud. The bottom appeared like a fire. A rainbow was over it. And around the cloud were 10,000 angels singing a most lovely song. And on it sat the Son of Man, and on his head were crowns. His hair was white and curly and lay on his shoulders. His feet had the appearance of fire. In his right hand was a sharp sickle. In his left a silver trumpet. His eyes were as a flame of fire, which searched his children through and through. Then Jesus' silver trumpet sounded. And as he descended on the cloud wrapped in flames of fire, he gazed on the graves of the sleeping saints. Then he raised his eyes and his hands to heaven, and he cried, "Awake, awake, awake, ye that sleep in the dust, and arise." Then there was a mighty earthquake. The graves were opened. The dead came up clothed with immortality. The 144,000 shouted, "Alleluia," as they recognized their friends who had been torn from them by death. In the same moment, we were changed and caught up together with them to meet the Lord in the air. We all entered the clouds together and were 7 days ascending to the sea of glass. Once she was in the city, Ellen White was shown the life and the throne of God. She was especially thrilled to see two of the Millerite ministers there, Charles Fitch and Levi Stockman. Both of them had died in 1844. She said they asked what had passed through while they were sleeping. And we tried to call up our greatest trials, but they looked so small and compared with the far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory that surrounded us that we could not speak them out. And we cried out, "Alleluia! Heaven is cheap enough." And we touched our golden harps, and we made heaven's arches ring. And then Ellen White came out of vision, Ellen Harmon. She said, "A gloom was spread over all I beheld. Oh, how dark this world looked to me. I wept when I found myself here, and I felt homesick. I had seen a better world, and it had spoiled this for me." Do you weep when you think about heaven? Is that your real home? Because you know we're just pilgrims here. We're just traveling through. Heaven is our real home. Well, she shared the vision with those other 4 women that were there in the Haynes home. And they were excited to learn what God had shown her. Their prayers had been answered. God had led them all. After all, the midnight cry was real, and it was a providence from God. It was pictured as light. Light behind them shone all along the path. But most importantly, that vision gave them assurance that if they kept their eyes fixed on Jesus, they would safely reach the heavenly city. And the vision even gave them a faint idea of what the reward would be like when they reached that city. "172 years ago, our forefathers and mothers realized that Jesus was coming back and coming very soon. And I think for us today, sometimes when we feel a little discouraged, when we feel a little down, when we feel like the Christian walk is a little tough, and sometimes it gets hard, and sometimes we find it hard to put Jesus in the forefront, we need to think about those early pioneers and what they went through, and how they never gave up their faith, but how they stood true and strong. Can you imagine the opposition they must have faced right after the great disappointment? Yet they never gave up. And they continued to shine for Jesus and continue to share his word throughout the world. And today, instead of a handful of believers, there's 17 to 18 million Seventh-day Adventists in the world today. The fastest growing denomination on the face of the earth, because we really believe Jesus is coming back again. And we want to be ready. Not only us, but we want all of our friends and neighbors to be there with us, don't we? As we close, I'd like you to take your hymnals out. And let's look at our last hymn as we sing it together, "I'm a Pilgrim." Number 444.